In the quiet, seemingly peaceful town of Hollow Creek, there was an unsettling presence that most couldn't quite put their finger on. If you walked through the woods on the outskirts of town, you'd notice something wasn't quite right. An eerie stillness, a silence too thick, too unnatural, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the normal hum of life seemed to fade the deeper you ventured into the woods. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, someone, and it was in these woods where the real story of Hollow Creek began, at least the one that would terrify the town for generations. A long time ago, before Hollow Creek became the quiet town it was today, it was a bustling settlement, a place where people came to live in peace, to settle down and start families. But there was always a dark undercurrent to the town, something that never seemed to settle, no matter how hard the people tried to ignore it. You see, in the heart of Hollow Creek, there was an old abandoned house, surrounded by the wild forest. The house, overgrown with ivy, had stood for years, empty and forgotten by most, but for some, it held a dreadful fascination. Local legends swirled around it, speaking of its dark history. Some said it was built on cursed ground, others whispered that the house was a haven for dark rituals, where people had vanished without a trace, never to be seen again. But the truth was even darker. On a crisp autumn evening, a young man named Samuel Matthews, an outsider who had recently moved to Hollow Creek, decided to uncover the mysteries that lay hidden within the walls of that forsaken house. Samuel had always been a curious soul, drawn to the strange and the unknown, and when he heard the whispers from the locals about the house, he felt an irresistible pull. Despite warnings from the townsfolk, Samuel ventured into the woods alone, the pale moonlight casting eerie shadows along his path. The wind howled through the trees, and the branches creaked, as if the forest itself was alive, watching him. Wait. As he approached the house, he couldn't help but feel a strange, unsettling sensation crawl up his spine. The house loomed before him, towering and silent. The windows, long since broken, gaped like dark, hollow eyes. It was the kind of place that would make even the most seasoned adventurer hesitate. But not Samuel. He stepped onto the creaky wooden porch, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the doorknob, but something urged him forward. The door creaked open, and a rush of cold air greeted him like an unseen hand, beckoning him inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped drastically, as if the house was sucking the warmth from the air itself. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. Samuel's breath came out in a visible fog, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He took a step deeper into the house, his flashlight cutting through the darkness like a fragile beam of hope. The floorboards creaked under his feet, and as he moved through the dusty, abandoned rooms, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The walls were adorned with peeling wallpaper, faded with age, and the furniture, though covered in dust, was oddly arranged, as though someone had hastily left the house, leaving everything behind in a hurry. Then, there was a sound. At first, Samuel thought it was just the house settling, the wood groaning under its weight. But then he heard it again, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like a breath just behind his ear. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The whisper came again, clearer this time, and unmistakable. It was a voice, but not a voice that belonged to anyone he knew. Leave, now. Samuel's blood ran cold, but his curiosity pushed him forward. He couldn't just leave, not yet. He had come this far, and he needed answers. He followed the whispering voice, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The voice led him down a narrow hallway to a small, dimly lit room at the back of the house. The walls of the room were covered in strange symbols, etched into the stone, with what looked like old blood. The air here was thicker, almost suffocating, and the temperature had dropped to a point where Samuel could see his breath misting in front of him. At the center of the room, there was an old rusted iron door, its surface covered in strange markings. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the house itself was urging him to turn back. Don't open it, a voice hissed. But Samuel, unable to resist, stepped forward, his hand reaching for the door. When his fingers brushed the cold metal, the temperature in the room plummeted. A chilling wind swept through the room, extinguishing his flashlight and plunging him into darkness. Panic surged through Samuel, but before he could react, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the bowels of the earth. With no other choice, Samuel descended, each step echoing through the thick silence. The air down there was damp, heavy with the smell of earth and decay, and as he reached the bottom, he found himself in a vast underground chamber. At the far end of the chamber, there was a stone altar, covered in symbols that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. But it wasn't just the altar that caught his attention, it was the shadow, the dark shapes that seemed to move and shift around him, flickering like ghosts in the corner of his eyes. Samuel's heart raced as he turned to face the altar. A figure stood there, cloaked in shadows, its face hidden in darkness. The figure raised a hand, and the shadows began to writhe and twist, forming into something more, something alive. The voice, the whispers, all of it, was coming from this figure. But what was it? What had Samuel uncovered? Suddenly the room felt colder, the shadows more oppressive. The figure began to speak, its voice like 100 voices speaking in unison, a cacophony of terror that reverberated through the very walls of the chamber. "You should have left when you had the chance, Samuel," the voice echoed, sending chills down his spine. And that was when the true horror of Hollow Creek revealed itself. It wasn't the house that was cursed, it wasn't the land, it was the shadows themselves, ancient and malevolent, trapped beneath Hollow Creek, waiting for the right moment to break free. The whispering shadows had been trapped here for centuries, their power feeding off the fear of those who dared to venture too close. And now they had found Samuel. His last breath was a scream, but no one heard it, except the shadow. The next morning, the people of Hollow Creek woke to find that Samuel had vanished, his disappearance just another in a long line of strange events surrounding the old house. But the whispers continued, still echoing through the woods, still calling to those brave or foolish enough to listen. The shadows were still there, waiting, always waiting, for the next person to step into the house and uncover the terrible secret of Hollow Creek. And so the cycle continued. As the days passed after Samuel's disappearance, the people of Hollow Creek couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavier, thicker, as though the town was being slowly suffocated by an unseen presence. The woods, which had always been a place of refuge for those seeking peace and solitude, seemed darker now. The shadows within them no longer felt like the harmless play of light in trees. No, these shadows were something else entirely, something old, ancient and weighty. The town itself seemed to shrink, as if it was pulling inward, trying to escape whatever it was that had awakened in those woods. The streets were quieter, the usual hum of life replaced by a thick silence that pressed against every building, every home. People moved about their daily routines, with a heightened sense of unease, as if they knew something was watching them, something, waiting. Most avoided the woods now, and the house of course was completely off limit. But there were still those who ventured too close to the dark forest, those who didn't believe in the superstitions of the townsfolk. They would walk by the tree line, daring to glance into the thickening woods, only to feel an overwhelming sense of dread wash over them. They'd rush home, hearts pounding, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them, something that was always just out of sight, just behind them, whispering. It was during one of these restless nights that another tragedy struck. Margaret, a local teacher, who had lived in Hollow Creek her entire life, went missing. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Her husband Frank searched the house frantically, calling out her name, but there was no answer. The windows were shut tight, the doors locked. There were no signs of a struggle, no clues to her disappearance, except for one chilling detail, the faintest trace of what looked like blood leading out the back door and into the woods. The search party was formed immediately. A dozen men and women, armed with flashlights, set out to find Margaret. They followed the trail, but it was as though the woods were shifting before their very eyes, the path twisting and turning in unnatural directions. Every time they thought they were getting closer, the trail would disappear. The air grew colder, and the deeper they ventured, the more disoriented they became. It was as if the forest was playing tricks on them, distorting their sense of direction, making them second-guess every step they took. They came across the abandoned house. Not long into their search, the old, decrepit structure stood like a monolith, its broken windows staring out at them, like empty, hollow eyes. As they approached, the whispers began, low at first, barely audible, then louder and more distant. The voices, soft and pleading, echoed from inside the house, chilling the very air around them. Leave, leave, leave. But they didn't leave. They couldn't. The compulsion to move forward was too great, too powerful, and one by one, they entered the house. The front door creaked open, as if it had been waiting for them all along, and just like that, they were inside. The atmosphere within the house was thick, oppressive, like a heavy weight pressing down on them. Their breath came out in visible clouds. As they ventured deeper into the house, their flashlights shaking in their hands, the walls were covered in the same strange symbols that Samuel had discovered, symbols that seemed to pulse and shift when they weren't looking directly at them. The whispers were louder now, echoing from all directions, surrounding them. The further they moved, the stronger the pull grew. It was as if the house itself was alive, feeding off their fear, drawing them deeper into its grasp. Some of the searchers tried to turn back, but they could. They were rooted to the spot, as though invisible hands held them in place. The fear was suffocating, relentless, and it only grew worse with each passing second. They made their way to the basement, following the faintest of footsteps, Margaret's last traces. The basement door, like everything else in the house, had a malevolent air about it, old, rusted, and groaning as they pushed it open. The stairs leading down were slick with a dark substance that dripped from the ceiling. They descended slowly, the noise of their footsteps loud in the thick silence, but when they reached the bottom, they were met with an unspeakable sight. There in the center of the room was the altar, and on it, a figure, the same shadowy figure that Samuel had seen, stood waiting. The figure was obscured in darkness, but there was no mistaking it. The presence emanating from it was unmistakably familiar. The whispers became a cacophony, 1,000 voices screaming in unison, urging them to flee. But just like Samuel, the searchers couldn't move. Their legs wouldn't obey them. The shadows, which had once been just shapes in the corner of their eyes, were now alive, swirling around them, like a living, breathing entity. A voice, low and distorted, cut through the madness. It was the same voice they had heard when they entered the house. You shouldn't have come here. None of you should have come here. The figure stepped forward, and the shadows followed. It was almost like they were a part of it, as though the darkness itself was alive, and it was hungry. One by one, the searchers began to they were pulled into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness without a sound. No one could see what was happening to them, but the air grew thick with an unholy presence. Each scream, each desperate plea for help, was quickly swallowed by the suffocating silence that followed. Frank, Margaret's husband, was the last to remain. He stood frozen, eyes wide with terror, as he watched his friends and family vanish into the shadows. Margaret, he whispered, his voice barely audible, but his wife was already lost. She had joined the shadows long ago. The darkness had claimed her, just as it had claimed everyone else. And then Frank too was gone. The shadows had swallowed him whole, and the house was once again still, its whispers fading into nothing. The forest around it grew even darker, and the town of Hollow Creek remained unaware of the horrors that had just unfolded. The disappearance of Margaret, and the others, was yet another unsolved mystery in the town's long history. There were no bodies, no evidence to suggest what had happened. The house remained abandoned, and the whispers, they continued. Only a few brave souls would dare venture near, but most of the townsfolk avoided it altogether. The shadows had been released, and they were hungry. It was only a matter of time before they claimed more. And somewhere deep within the bowels of the old house, beneath Hollow Creek, the whispering shadows waited, always waiting for the next soul to wander too close, for the next person to hear their call. Because the shadows never forget, they never stop hunting, and they never let you leave. As the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the legend of the whispering shadows grew. Hollow Creek, once a place of quiet, peaceful living, became a town wrapped in fear. Families began moving away, unable to bear the suffocating terror that seemed to hang over them, suffused into the very air they breathed. Even the bravest souls, those who had once dared to dismiss the town's whispered stories as nothing more than old folklore, began to question everything they thought they knew. No one knew what had happened to Frank, Margaret, and the others who had gone searching for her. A search had been thorough, every inch of Hollow Creek and its surroundings scoured, but there was no sign of the missing people. Their families, devastated and broken, could only hold on to the hope that they might return. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. No one who ventured into that house ever came back, and those who did, the few who returned after narrowly escaping its grip, were never quite the same. Their eyes were haunted, their voices cracked with the terror they'd witnessed, their bodies forever marked by an invisible force that clung to them like a second skin. One such person was Robert Hayes, a local contractor who had always been skeptical of the supernatural. He had lived in Hollow Creek his entire life, and had heard the rumors and gossip about the old house for as long as he could remember. But it wasn't until a late night in early winter, when the streets were slick with ice, and the wind howled through the trees, that Robert's curiosity got the better of him. He had to know the truth. The stories, the rumors, the disappearances, they'd been gnawing at him for years, and now they seemed more real than ever. On that bitterly cold evening, Robert decided to confront the house once and for all. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, and the bravado of someone who had lived through every kind of misfortune life had to offer, he set off alone, walking through the dense forest towards the abandoned house. The night was unusually dark, and the trees seemed to twist and turn in strange, unnatural shapes, as though the forest itself was guiding him. As he approached the house, the air grew thick with an almost suffocating sense of dread. Every step he took felt heavier, as if the ground beneath his feet were resisting his movement. The house loomed in the distance, its broken windows staring out at him, like empty sockets, dark and cold. A distant rumble of thunder echoed from far away, and for the briefest of moments, Robert thought he might turn back. But then he thought of the stories, the whispers, the missing people, and he pushed on. When he reached the house, he hesitated for only a moment. He could feel it, that presence, that overwhelming weight that pressed against his chest, as if the very walls of the house were alive and watching him. But Robert was determined. With a deep breath, he pushed open the door, and the familiar creak of the old wood echoed through the night. Inside, the house was eerily silent. The air was cold and damp, the walls covered in dust and grime. But there was something else, a sense of waiting. Robert had been in abandoned buildings before, but nothing like this. The feeling was oppressive, suffocating. Every corner seemed to hide something, and every shadow seemed to move just out of the corner of his eye. The whispers began as soon as he stepped inside. At first they were faint, like a soft breeze rustling the leaves, but then they grew louder and clearer, until it was as though 1,000 voices were speaking at once, their words a blur of unintelligible sounds. The whispers crawled up his spine, sending shivers through his body, but Robert pressed on, his flashlight flickering with each step. The temperature seemed to drop with every room he entered, until his breath was visible in the air. He could feel the weight of something dark, something ancient, pressing down on him, and it grew stronger as he descended into the basement. The basement door groaned as he pushed it open, the hinges screeching in protest, and there at the bottom of the stairs was the altar, the very same altar that Samuel and the others had seen before him. It was exactly as they had described it, stone, old, covered in strange symbols that seemed to writhe and pulse in the faint light of his flashlight. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and twist, as though alive. Robert's heart raced as the whispers grew louder, more urgent. They surrounded him, suffusing the air with a sense of unease that made it impossible to think clearly. And then, it spoke. A voice, deep and distorted, rang out from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come, Rob." His breath caught in his throat. The voice was familiar, yet not. It was as though it came from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating through the very walls of the room. The shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, moving like liquid, twisting into shapes that defied reason. Robert's heart hammered in his chest, as the darkness seemed to close in on him, filling the room with an oppressive weight. He could feel the presence now, surrounding him, pressing in from all sides. It wasn't just a voice, it was something more, something ancient and malevolent, a force that had been trapped in this house for generations, feeding on the fear and despair of those who dared to come near. "Leave this place," the voice continued. "Leave, or you will be lost like the other." But Robert didn't leave. His curiosity had brought him here, and now his fear anchored him in place. He wanted to understand what was happening, why the shadows were so hungry, why this house held such a hold on those who dared to enter it. But as the darkness swirled around him, the whispers growing louder and more insistent. He felt the room closing in on him. His flashlight flickered and went out, leaving him in complete darkness. He could no longer see the shadows, but he could feel them, creeping over his skin, crawling under his clothes. His breathing grew shallow as his body fought to break free from the invisible grip that held him in place. His heart raced, and his mind screamed for him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was trapped. Then through the darkness, he heard something, a sound that sent a chill down his spine, a low guttural growl that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. And then, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from behind him. The last thing Robert heard was his own scream, a sound so filled with terror it seemed to echo through the very walls of the house. And then, just as with the others before him, he was consumed by the shadow. The next morning, when the search party arrived, they found nothing, not a trace of Robert, not a single clue to where he had gone. The house, as always, stood silent and still, the whispering shadows hidden deep within its walls, waiting. And the town of Hollow Creek, it only grew quieter, the whispers growing stronger with each passing year. More people left, never to return, and those who stayed, they could feel it too, the presence that haunted the very land, the ancient darkness that lingered in the corners of their world. But no one ever spoke of the shadows. No one dared to, because they knew, deep down, that the shadows were always watching, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. And the whispers would never stop. The town of Hollow Creek had become a shell of its former self. The streets that once bustled with activity were now empty, save for the occasional car that passed through. The houses stood, abandoned or empty, with shutters closed, and doors locked tight, as if the town itself was trying to keep whatever was in the woods from creeping any further. The people who had once lived there, the families who had thrived in this quiet corner of the world, had all but vanished. The town's remaining residents whispered about the house, about the shadows that had claimed so many lives, but they dared not go near. They had heard the stories of the disappearing townsfolk, the ones who went into the woods, drawn by that malevolent force, and never came back. Those brave enough to venture too close found themselves lost, their minds shattered, their bodies never found. The few who returned were broken. Speaking of the whispers, of the shadows that seemed to stretch and claw at them from the very air. But even with the silence of the town, there was always a feeling that something was coming, that something worse was waiting. On the outskirts of Hollow Creek, there was a cabin, a small humble place that had been abandoned years ago, after the previous owner, an elderly man named Everett, had disappeared. No one knew exactly when or why he left, but the cabin had sat there, alone and forgotten, in the shadow of the woods. Over the years, it had grown weathered and dilapidated, the roof sagging, the windows boarded up, and vines creeping over the structure, like the fingers of some ancient creature. It was there, in that very cabin, where the next chapter of Hollow Creek's nightmare would begin. A young woman named Clara Porter had recently moved to Hollow Creek, a fresh face in a town that had become a ghost town. She had come in search of peace, having inherited a small fortune from a distant relative, and wishing to escape the hectic, bustling life she had known in the city. Clara had heard the rumors, of course, but she had dismissed them. She didn't believe in ghost stories or dark legends. The supernatural was something for fiction books and movies, not real life. Clara rented a small cottage on the edge of the town, just at the foot of the woods, and at first, everything seemed quiet enough. The air was crisp, the scenery beautiful, and the peace she so desperately sought began to settle over her, like a soft blanket. But that was before the dreams started. At first they were subtle, little glimpses of shadows flickering at the edge of her vision, voices she couldn't quite place. But over the course of days, they grew more intense. She would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat, the shadows still haunting her, lingering in the corners of her mind. Sometimes she thought she could hear faint whispers calling her name, their voices like a breath just behind her ear. One night Clara couldn't take it anymore. The feeling of being watched, the overwhelming sense of dread, was too much. She had to know what was happening. She had to know if it was just her mind playing tricks, or if something truly was out there in the woods. So on a moonless night, when the wind howled through the trees and the town was silent, Clara set out toward the forest. The cabin was her first. There was something about it, something that called to her. She had heard the stories about Everett, how he had lived there alone for years, keeping to himself, until he suddenly disappeared without a trace. The townsfolk speculated that he had gone mad, that the isolation of the cabin had driven him to some terrible fate. Clara, however, was determined to find out the truth. The walk to the cabin wasn't long,
But the deeper she went into the woods, the heavier the air became. The trees grew denser, the shadows darker. Clara felt as though the very forest was alive, watching her, judging her for trespassing into its domain. Her heart raced, but she pressed on, determined to uncover whatever secret the cabin might hold. When she reached the cabin, she found it in even worse condition than she had imagined. The door hung off its hinges, creaking in the wind, and the windows were boarded up, almost as if someone had intentionally sealed it away from the world. The air around it felt wrong, as if something had been waiting for her to arrive. Clara hesitated for a moment. She could feel it, a deep gnawing fear that seemed to come from the very earth beneath her feet. But then, with a deep breath, she stepped inside. The cabin was dark, musty and abandoned. The air was thick with the scent of rot, and the floorboards groaned under her weight. As she moved through the rooms, she noticed strange markings on the walls, symbols, drawn hastily, like a desperate attempt to ward off something. Some were carved into the wood, others drawn in what looked like charcoal. The more she looked, the more she felt the oppressive weight of the place. But it was when she reached the basement that she felt it. The darkness. The stairs leading down were narrow and steep, and Clara had to force herself to take each step, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with each one. At the bottom of the stairs, the air was thick, stagnant and cold. She fumbled for a flashlight, turning it on to reveal the damp stone walls of the basement. In the center of the room was a table, old and covered with dust. But it wasn't the table that caught her attention. No, it was what lay on the wall opposite. A large dark stain had spread across the wall, as though something or someone had been dragged across it. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she moved closer, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The stain wasn't just dirt or mold. It was something darker, something more ominous. The shadows seemed to dance around it, flickering in unnatural patterns. And that's when she saw it. A small wooden box sitting on the table. The box was old, covered in dust, and its surface was etched with strange symbols. The same symbols she had seen carved into the wall. Clara's heart raced as she reached for it. She wasn't sure why she felt so compelled to open it, but something inside her told her that it was important. Her fingers brushed the lid of the box, and suddenly the shadows in the room grew darker. The whispers began, soft at first, like a distant murmur. They grew louder and louder, until they filled the entire room, and Clara felt as though the very walls were closing in around her. The box trembled in her hands, as though it was alive.
When Clara opened the box, she found nothing but a small black stone inside, a stone that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The moment her fingers touched it, the shadows surged forward, enveloping her in darkness. The last thing Clara heard before everything went black was a voice whispering her name. The darkness was hungry, and it had just found its next victim. And so the cycle began anew. The house, the cabin, the shadows, they waited, always waited. The whispers would never stop, the hunger would never be satisfied, and Clara would be the next to be lost. Her name just another whisper in the wind, lost in the dark, waiting for someone else to come, to listen, and to become the next soul claimed by Hollow Creek. The darkness lingered in Hollow Creek, its presence inescapable. It had become something more than a mere rumor, more than just a shadow cast over the town. It had taken root in the very soil, in the hearts of the people who had once called the place home. With each disappearance, each vanishing into the blackened abyss of the house and the forest, the town's history grew darker, heavier. The air itself seemed to carry a weight that pressed against every soul, every heartbeat, suffocating those left behind. Clara Porter's disappearance was met with quiet disbelief. No one dared speak of it aloud, for fear that speaking her name would invite the shadows once more. The cabin where she had gone, the place where the darkness had claimed her, remained untouched, its rotting wooden frame decaying even further with the passing days. And though the town itself remained, there were few who could still call Hollow Creek home. Most had fled, too afraid to stay, leaving only the brave, or the foolish, who remained behind. But for those who stayed, life carried on with a certain hollow routine, a surreal existence in the shadow of the curse. But one night, something shifted. In the midst of the winter's chill, when the winds howled and the world seemed still, a man arrived in Hollow Creek. His name was Thomas Farrow, a journalist from the city who had heard the stories about the town's cursed history. Unlike the others who had ventured into the woods and had been consumed by the shadows, Thomas was different. He was driven, relentless in his search for the truth. He had heard the tales of Hollow Creek from old stories whispered by travelers, and he knew that this was a place that begged to be uncovered. If only he could get to the heart of the mystery. When Thomas arrived, the town was desolate, eerily quiet. The wind cut through the streets like a blade, and the shutters of the remaining buildings rattled in protest against the chill. It was as if Hollow Creek itself had been abandoned by life, save for the few souls who still lingered on, trapped in their own Thomas approached one of the remaining taverns, its sign hanging crookedly above the door. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, the dim glow of lanterns casting long shadows across the room. The few people who remained in the tavern were quiet, their eyes hollow, their movements slow, as though they had grown accustomed to the fear that gripped their hearts. Thomas took a seat at the bar, ordering a drink as he surveyed the room, looking for anyone who might have answered. The bartender, an old man with a grizzled face, eyed Thomas with a look of caution, his eyes flicking over to the window nervously. "You're here for the stories, aren't you?" the bartender muttered, pouring Thomas a drink. His hands shook slightly, his gaze shifting toward the door as though expecting someone or something to enter. "I'm here for the truth," Thomas replied. "I've heard the stories. I've heard about the house, the shadows, the disappearances. What happened here? Why are people afraid to speak of it?" The bartender's eyes darkened, and he leaned in closer, his voice barely a whisper. "You don't want to know the truth, son. Trust me, some stories are better left untold. You don't understand what's been lurking here for centuries. You don't know what you're walking into." But Thomas wasn't deterred. He had heard such warnings before, and they only made him more determined. "I need to understand," he said firmly. "If there's something in those woods, something evil, then it's my job to uncover it. I'm not afraid." The bartender sighed, his shoulders slumping as though carrying the weight of generations. "You think you're not afraid, but when the shadows come for you, it's too late. They don't just take your body. They take everything. Your memories, your soul, everything that makes you who you are. And when you're gone, the town forgets you ever existed." The whispers keep going, and the shadows, they keep growing. There's no escaping it once you've been marked. The bartender fell silent, his eyes glassy as though lost in some distant memory. His words hung in the air like an unspoken warning. But Thomas was resolute. He couldn't leave without knowing the truth, no matter the cost. "I'll find out for myself," Thomas muttered, standing up from his seat and pushing through the tavern's door into the cold night. The town seemed to close around him as he walked down the narrow streets, his breath misting in the air. He made his way toward the edge of the forest, where the old house stood, looming like a spectre over the land. The air grew colder the closer he got, the wind howling through the bare branches of the trees, as if the woods themselves were alive and watching. Thomas knew what he had to do. He had to go into the house. The answers, whatever they were, had to be inside. As he crossed the threshold of the house, the door creaked closed behind him, sealing him inside with the darkness. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft whispers that seemed to hum in the air. He moved cautiously through the house, his flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. Every step he took felt as though it was being watched, the oppressive atmosphere suffocating him as he made his way deeper into the heart of the house. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that twisted and writhed as if alive. Thomas paused, his gaze lingering on them for a moment, a sense of dread settling over him. There was something undeniably wrong about this place, something ancient and evil. The house had been abandoned, but it felt as though it were alive, as if it were waiting for him to uncover its secret. And then, as he descended the stairs into the basement, he saw it, an altar, the same altar that had been described by the others, the one Samuel had seen, the one that had claimed so many lives. The shadows in the room seemed to grow thicker, darker, pressing in from all sides. It was as though the very air was alive with malevolent energy. A voice rang out, low and distorted, echoing from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here, Thomas Farrow." The voice sent chills down his spine, but he stood his ground. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What are you? Why are you doing this to these people?" The shadows shifted, swirling around him like a living, breathing entity. "We are the darkness that has always been here. We are the forgotten, the lost, the ones who never had a chance. We have been waiting, Thomas, waiting for someone like you to come. You've come seeking answers, but you won't leave with any, not alive." Suddenly, the room seemed to close in on him,
the darkness thickening until it was all he could see. The whispers grew louder, their voices blending into one unholy sound, the very air vibrating with their presence. Thomas felt a pull, an overwhelming force that tried to drag him deeper into the shadows. He struggled, trying to break free, but it was no use. The darkness was everywhere, suffocating him, consuming him, and then just as the darkness swallowed him whole, he heard one final whisper. "You are one of us now, forever." The whispers faded into the silence. Hollow Creek was once again quiet, and so, another soul was lost to the shadow. The people of Hollow Creek would continue to live in their fear, their lives marked by the curse of the house, and the woods that surrounded them. The town would fade into nothingness, its name forgotten by all, except those who dared to speak of it in hushed tones, warnings for those who might wander too close. The shadows would continue their hunt, always waiting, always hungry for the next soul to claim, and the whispers, they would never stop, they would never be silenced. Hollow Creek was no more, but the darkness, it would remain, forever. The wind howled through the skeletal trees, its mournful cry, echoing through the forsaken streets of Hollow Creek. The town had long since been abandoned by most of its people. What was once a thriving community had now become little more than a ghost town, a place where time stood still, and the past was never truly buried. The shadows that hung over the land were not mere remnants of history, they were living things, breathing in the silence, waiting, always waiting. There were, however, still a few who remained, those who had nowhere else to go, those who had nowhere left to run. Among them was an old man named Earl, who had lived in Hollow Creek his entire life. Earl had seen it all, the rise of the town, the whispers that grew louder with each passing decade, and the disappearances that had haunted the place for as long as anyone could remember. Earl was one of the few who had not fled when the curse had started to take hold. He had buried his family years ago, lost them to the same shadows that had claimed so many others. His heart had hardened, his spirit dimmed by the knowledge that no one who entered the woods ever returned. He had watched as one by one, the townsfolk left, either too terrified, or too desperate to stay in a place where the very land seemed to be alive with evil. But Earl remained, not out of bravery, but out of resignation. He had seen too much to be afraid anymore. The nights were the hardest for Earl. It was during the long cold hours of the night that the house called to him. From his worn rickety porch, he could see it looming in the distance, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring back at him. The house was no longer just a structure, it was a presence, an entity that lived and breathed in the darkness. He knew it was only a matter of time before the shadows reached out for him, just as they had reached for everyone else. But one night something was different. Earl awoke to a sound that was unmistakable, the creak of footsteps on the porch. He froze, his heart racing as he listened. It wasn't the wind this time. No, this was real. Someone, something, was out there. Earl's old bones ached as he slowly got out of bed and made his way to the door. His hands trembled as he gripped the worn handle, but he forced himself to open it. The night air was cold, biting, and the world beyond his doorstep was shrouded in a thick fog. The woods, usually silent, seemed to be alive with a subtle energy that hummed in the air, but there was no one there. No figure standing on the porch, no movement in the fog, just silence. He stepped outside, his eyes scanning the darkness. The feeling of being watched washed over him, and he couldn't shake the sense that something was very wrong. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he looked toward the woods. The trees, skeletal and twisted, seemed to sway in a way that felt unnatural, as though they were reaching toward him, beckoning him into their depth. Then he heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate just behind him. His heart skipped a beat as he whipped around, but still there was nothing. The fog swallowed the porch, and everything beyond it, leaving him feeling as if he was standing on the edge of some endless abyss. His hand instinctively reached for the rifle he kept by the door, but just as his fingers brushed the cold wood of the stock, a voice cut through the silence. "Earl." The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but there was no mistaking it. Earl froze, his blood running cold. He knew that voice. "Lena," he croaked, his voice trembling. He hadn't heard his wife's voice in years, not since that night when the shadows had taken her, just as they had taken so many others. Her disappearance had been the beginning of the end for Hollow Creek. The night she had vanished had marked the first time Earl truly understood the evil that dwelled within the woods. The voice spoke again, and this time, there was something unmistakably wrong about it. "Come to me, Earl. I'm waiting." Earl's heart pounded in his chest as he turned toward the woods. The fog was thicker now, swirling around the trees like living tendrils, wrapping around his legs as he stepped forward. The voice continued to beckon him, its tone soft and soothing, as if it were calling him to a reunion with something long lost. He could almost see her, Lena, standing just beyond the tree line, her figure barely visible in the shifting fog. Earl, it's time to join me. He took a step, then another, his feet carrying him toward the woods, without him even realizing it. His heart ached, his mind clouded with a strange sense of longing. It's just her, he thought. It has to be. She's waiting for me. But as he stepped deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, the fog thicker, the voices began to grow louder, a chorus of whispers rising from the earth itself, swirling around him like a storm. He tried to move forward, but his feet felt like they were stuck in mud, each step heavier than the last. The darkness seemed to close in on him, suffocating him as the whispers merged into a single ominous voice. You shouldn't have come, Earl. His blood ran cold. The voice, it wasn't Lena, it was something else, something darker, more insidious. The shadows had been playing him, luring him in with the illusion of his wife's voice. Earl struggled, trying to free his feet from the unseen grip that held him in place. But it was too late. He was surrounded. The trees loomed above him, like giant twisted hands, their gnarled branches reaching down, closing in on him. The shadows coiled and twisted around him, filling the air with a suffocating darkness. He couldn't see the way forward, couldn't find a path out of the nightmare that had consumed him. And then from the heart of the darkness, a figure emerged, tall and shrouded in shadows, its face obscured. It was the same figure that had appeared in the house, the one that had claimed Samuel and the others. The figure raised a hand, and the shadows moved with it, stretching like tendrils toward Earl. You are ours now, Earl, the figure whispered, its voice low and hollow. The shadows claim all who enter, all who dare to listen. Earl's breath caught in his throat as the shadows closed in on him, pulling him into their depths. His body was no longer his own, his mind consumed by the darkness that surrounded him. He struggled, but it was useless. The shadows were too powerful, too ancient. And then, as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole, Earl was gone. The next morning, the fog lifted, and the woods were still. The house sat silent on the hill, its broken windows staring out at the empty town. There was no sign of Earl, no trace of his passing. The whispers had faded into nothingness, leaving only the quiet, oppressive weight of the darkness behind. In Hollow Creek, the cycle continued. Another soul claimed, another name forgotten. The shadows never ceased in their hunt, and so the town stood empty, abandoned, forgotten by the world, but never truly empty. The darkness still clung to the land, and the whispers still called out to those brave or foolish enough to listen. For as long as the house stood, as long as the shadows remained, Hollow Creek would never be free. It would never be forgotten. The years passed, and Hollow Creek seemed to become little more than a memory, a place whispered about in hushed tones, among those who had never stepped foot near its haunted borders. The few who had once called the town home had either fled or died, their names fading with time. But even in its desolation, the curse of Hollow Creek had not loosened its grip. It never truly left. The house, standing stoic atop the hill, was still there. The shadows still waited, but somewhere far from Hollow Creek, the whispers began to spread once more. It was a cold evening in a distant town, nothing more than an ordinary town really, that a woman named Anna arrived. She had heard stories of Hollow Creek, of course, but it was all just legend to her. Stories told around campfires, recited with trembling voices, passed down through generations, of those who had either never been to Hollow Creek, or had run from it before they could speak its name, without fear. Anna, a young journalist with a passion for truth, had never been one to dismiss things as myth or superstition. She wanted facts, evidence, the story behind the whisper. She was relentless, driven by something she couldn't quite explain, a fascination with the unknown, with things that were supposed to remain hidden. Hollow Creek was her next stop. She packed a bag, her mind already racing with questions, her pulse quickening at the thought of uncovering what lay within the ruins of the town. Anna had worked in the field of investigative journalism, long enough to know how stories of cursed places, missing persons, and dark folklore could grow larger than life. But she also knew that behind every urban legend, there was a thread of truth waiting to be unearthed. What Anna didn't know, what no one could have known, was that Hollow Creek was no ordinary ghost story. It wasn't a place that could be uncovered, explored, or forgotten like the others. Hollow Creek was the darkness, and once it had set its sights on her, It would never let her go. Anna arrived late at night, the fog rolling in thick from the forest, a shroud that seemed to blanket the town in a suffocating silence. She drove into Hollow Creek slowly, her headlights cutting through the darkness. The town seemed deserted, like a place frozen in time, stuck somewhere between the present and the past. The houses, abandoned and decaying, stood like silent sentinels on the edge of a forgotten world. There were no signs of life, no movement, no one to greet. It was as if Hollow Creek had already forgotten her arrival, as if the town was waiting for something. She parked her car at the edge of the road, and stepped out feeling the chill of the night seep into her bones. The air was thick, heavy, filled with a kind of tension that made her skin crawl. She pulled her jacket tightly around her shoulders, and headed towards the old tavern, the only building that still seemed to show signs of life, though it was far from welcoming. Inside, the air was stale, the dim light flickering from a single lantern on the bar. The bartender was an old man, hunched over the counter with a faraway look in his eyes. When he saw Anna enter, his eyes narrowed, his mouth tightening into a thin, unreadable line. "You'll want to leave," he said, his voice rough, as though it hadn't been used in years. "There's nothing for you here." Anna stood at the threshold for a moment, unsure whether to step in or turn away. But the pull of curiosity, the same pull that had brought her here in the first place, was too strong. She took a step forward, walking slowly towards the bar. "I'm here for a story," she said, her voice steady despite the unease that settled in her stomach. "I'm not leaving until I find out what happened." The bartender didn't respond at first, just stared at her, his eyes vacant, as if he were trying to see her for something beyond the surface. Finally he spoke again, his voice low. "You think you can fix this? You think you can uncover what's buried here? It doesn't work like that. Once the darkness has set its eyes on you, it doesn't let go, not ever." "Who are you trying to warn?" Anna asked, more forcefully now. "The people who've come before me, the ones who didn't come back." The old man shuddered, his hands trembling as he poured himself a drink. "You don't know what you're walking into. Those people who disappeared, they weren't just lost, they were claimed by it." His voice dropped to a whisper, and he looked nervously over his shoulder, as if expecting something to come from the shadows behind him. Anna could feel the weight of his words settle over her. This wasn't just about missing persons, it wasn't about strange occurrences, or unexplained events. It was something deeper, something more malevolent. She leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened to them? What is it? What's in the woods? What's in the house?" The bartender took a long sip of his drink, then met her eyes, his gaze filled with something that bordered on sorrow, fear, and regret. "The house, the shadows, they wait," he said, almost as if reciting a prayer. "It's always been here, always. The house calls to the lost, to the curious, to the ones who think they're strong enough to face it, but they never come back. Never." Anna's pulse quickened, her instincts telling her to leave now, to drive away before it was too late. But her mind, fueled by the pursuit of a story, the story of a lifetime, kept her rooted in place. "Tell me everything you know," she demanded. The bartender hesitated, looking out the window towards the darkened trees. His voice dropped to a rasping whisper. "It started long ago, before the town was even built, before the house. It was always there. The shadows were waiting, and when the town was founded, they began to claim it, little by little. At first it was the woods, the people who walked too far, the ones who ventured past the borders of what they knew. They were taken just like that." He pointed to the window, to the forest beyond. "But then the house was built, and when it was finished, the darkness followed. The shadows are trapped beneath it, but they can still reach out. The house is the anchor, the gate. If you step inside, if you open that door, you'll be part of it, part of the curse forever." The words hung in the air, thick and oppressive. Anna didn't speak, she could barely think. The darkness he described. Was it possible? Was this why the town had fallen silent? Why no one dared come close? And then, just as quickly as it began, the bartender's gaze turned hollow. His face seemed to age right before her eyes, his features sinking into themselves. "You should leave now, before it's too late," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The shadows are already waiting for you." Anna turned to leave, her heart pounding in her chest. But when she opened the door to the tavern, she froze. The fog had thickened, swirling around her like a living thing. The trees seemed closer now, their gnarled branches reaching down towards the town, as if beckoning her into their depth. And from somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard a voice, soft, distant, yet unmistakable. "Anna." Her blood ran cold as she realized what it was. The house had begun calling her name. Anna stood frozen, her breath visible in the thick fog that had settled around her like a cold embrace. The town of Hollow Creek, once a place she thought she could uncover and document, now felt like an ancient trap, something that had been waiting for her arrival, patiently and without mercy. Her heart pounded in her chest, as the fog seemed to curl around her legs, pulling her toward the woods. The faint whisper of her name, once distant, was now clear. It echoed in her mind, impossibly close. Anna. She turned toward the source of the voice, though she saw nothing but the dark silhouette of the house, looming on the hill, its broken windows, like hollow eyes staring back at her. It was the same house that had been the source of all the legends, all the terror that had consumed Hollow Creek for generations. The house that had drawn in the curious, the desperate, the lost, and never let them live. The voice spoke again, this time sharper, clearer, as if it were beckoning her, urging her to come closer. Come inside, Anna. We've been waiting for you. Her feet moved of their own accord, drawn toward the house. Despite every instinct in her body screaming at her to run, to turn and never look back, her legs carried her forward, through the thick fog and toward the dark, crooked doorway. She knew what waited for her inside. The shadows, the darkness that had claimed so many before her. But something inside her, something she couldn't explain, drove her forward. The same force that had pulled her here in the first place. As she stepped over the threshold, the door creaked behind her, slamming shut as if locking her in. The air inside the house was colder than the night outside. The silence was thick, suffocating, broken only by the faint sound of her own breathing. Her flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. She had been inside countless abandoned buildings in her career, but none had ever felt like this. The house felt alive. It felt aware of her presence. She slowly moved through the rooms, her flashlight casting long trembling beams of light over the crumbling furniture, the rotting walls, but nothing about the house seemed abandoned. It felt as though someone had been there just moments ago, as though the place was waiting for her arrival. Her breath caught in her throat as she noticed the strange symbols etched into the walls, the same ones she had seen in the other accounts of those who had disappeared. Samuel, Margaret, Frank, Robert, they were all here, in this house, their stories written into the very fabric of the place. The house whispered to her now, its voice all around her, its words unintelligible, a disjointed chorus of cries and pleading. Leave, leave now, Anna. But it was too late. Her curiosity had already consumed her, and now, the house was claiming her as it had claimed so many before. She moved deeper into the house, unable to stop herself. The further she went, the darker it became. The shadows pressed in from every side, thick and oppressive. She felt them closing in, their cold fingers grazing her skin, their whispers louder now, more insistent. Come closer, the voice urged. It's time for you to join us. And then she saw it, in the distance, at the end of the long hallway. A door that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. She knew she had to go through it. There was no turning back now. As she approached, the door opened on its own, the creaking sound of the hinges echoing through the house. Beyond it was a room she hadn't seen before, dark, cold and covered in dust. In the center of the room was a stone altar, covered in the same symbols as the wall. The air was thick, the darkness almost tangible, as if it were alive. The shadows seemed to shift in time with her movements, following her every step. She stepped forward, drawn to the altar, and there, lying on the cold stone surface, was a small black stone, the same stone described by those who had come before her, the one that had drawn them in, the one that marked the moment they were claimed by the house. Anna reached out, her fingers brushing the cold stone. The moment her skin made contact, the room seemed to explode in a blinding rush of dark energy. The shadows surged forward, enveloping her, suffocating her, pulling her into their depths. You are ours now, Anna. 1,000 voices whispered in unison, their words a single, endless scream. Her body went rigid, as the shadows wrapped around her, their tendrils curling into her very soul. She could feel them consuming her every memory, every breath, every thought. Her vision blurred, her thoughts became fragmented. She tried to scream, to fight, but it was no use. The darkness was too strong. Her mind shattered, consumed by the shadows, and then all was silent. The next morning, Hollow Creek remained silent. The fog had lifted, and the sun struggled to break through the dense clouds that loomed over the town. The house stood on the hill, its broken windows staring out over the abandoned streets, like dark, unblinking eyes. But there were no new whispers, no new cries, no more stories to tell. Hollow Creek had consumed Anna, just as it had consumed so many before her. The house, still standing, still waiting, would remain as it always had, drawing in the next curious soul, the next lost wanderer, and the cycle would continue. The whispers would rise again, the shadows would continue to stretch across the land, claiming the souls of those who dared to listen. And Hollow Creek, it would never truly die. It would never be forgotten. Because the darkness never stops waiting. It only waits for the next soul to hear its call.